Welcome to BICOM's Hadiyun weekly podcast. I'm delighted to have with us Brigadier General Assaf Orion, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies. His last job in the IDF, he was in the Planning Division of the IDF General Staff. Assaf, it's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Good morning. Thank you.
So really, I wanted to just catch up on events earlier this week. There was the extraordinary series of events where Israel was blamed for attacking sites in Latakia, perhaps some kind of weapons depot. And within that series of events over Syrian skies, Russia lost an aircraft. It later blamed Israel for using that aircraft as cover when it was maneuvering over Syrian skies. The first reaction from Russia was a very angry reaction, blaming Israel for that and creating a dangerous environment. Later, President Putin seemed a little bit less blaming of Israel, saying it was a series of tragic events. But the head of the Israeli Air Force has just gone today to Moscow to discuss all this with his Russian counterparts. And really the first question I wanted to ask was, why do you think this has happened, and what do you think has happened?
Well, generally speaking, the wider context is, of course, Iran's insistence on building up a threatening military capability in Syria and in Lebanon. And perhaps the spearhead of that is supplying precision missiles to Hezbollah to be able to better target Israel's rear and population centers. Now, Israel for the last year was very vocal, saying that it is resolved to stop and prevent this from occurring. And as has been recently disclosed, has executed more than 200 strikes in Syria since 2017. Now, so this is another day in the office, so to speak, when the Israeli Air Force goes and strikes 3 sites in Hama, Homs, and Latakia, as you said. And as it seems, these are connected to the precision weaponry effort of Iran and Hezbollah. After the strike and when the aircraft were back in Israeli airspace, Syrian air defense apparently did what it does usually in such cases, and that's going berserk and launching a very wide salvo of surface-to-air missiles. And at that point in time, there was a Russian reconnaissance aircraft in the area, and it was hit by a Syrian missile launch, which apparently didn't bother looking whether some friendly or civilian aircraft are in the air at the time.
Can I just ask, because I think it's something that a lot of observers don't perhaps appreciate, but when we say that the F-16s were back in Israeli airspace and then the Syrian anti-aircraft battery kind of fired, and we're talking about very short time frames here, aren't we? We're probably talking about not more than a few minutes, probably less, between those two events occurring.
Airspace incidents are usually short because of the velocity and speed, so it's not an hour later. But this is not the first time when Syrian air defense start launching only after the strike. It was also the case when the U.S. struck with cruise missiles after the chemical attack. So we're actually talking about Syrian air defense incompetence, recklessness, unprofessional and irresponsible conduct, and they actually shot their ally in the back, which is regrettable to all parties.
The other question I was going to ask, because I mean, you said that this is part of another day in the office in terms of Israel carrying out these strikes in Syria, but there was something slightly unusual, wasn't there? That the sites in Latakia were quite close to that very large Russian airbase, so you would have assumed that there would have been even tighter coordination between Russia and the Israeli Air Force, but also it was perhaps slightly more ambitious to be hitting targets so close to such a large Russian airbase, would you say?
If you recall the strikes on the T4 airfield, this is an airbase in which Russian units are also present. But Israel has been very, continuously cautious, both on coordinating on time or updating on time and making sure that no Russians are hurt. Now, assuring that Syrians don't shoot Russians from the sky is a bit above our pay grade. It's something that Israel cannot control. The initial or earlier allegations on using it as a cover are technically impossible and strategically improbable. No Israeli officer that I know of would ever consider such a move of risking a Russian aircraft to protect our own. We know how to protect our own, and risking Russians is totally against our interest. So I think if you follow the logic of who benefits, the conspiracy theory doesn't hold any water. And if you want to be a conspiracy theorist, so actually Syria and Iran are the ones who benefited from this event.
I mean, taking that to I suppose the next question, which is, we have the head of the Air Force, the Israeli Air Force in Moscow today, no doubt having discussions about this. But do you see anything changing operationally? I mean, if your explanation is what they're discussing, then the liaison between the Israeli Air Force and their discussions with their Russian counterparts is very close anyway. I mean, obviously they'll have to learn from this incident like you would with any. But do you see anything changing particularly? I mean, there were stories this morning, for instance, that Russia had closed Syrian airspace. I mean, you get rumors like this. Do you see anything changing operationally or in terms of how Israel will be able to maneuver its forces in Syrian airspace in the future?
Well, cautiously analyzing Russia's take here, well, they're actually or understandably grieving, and the Israel condolences and regrets in this sense are sincere and genuine.
Yeah.
There's a lot of wide strategic understanding between the parties. There's a deep appreciation and respect and coordination between the militaries. And so Russia certainly has to address now its domestic public on what it does after losing an aircraft and 15 aircrew. So that's understood. Closing up zones for exercises is a temporary move. It's known. It'll probably take a few days or a week or so, and then this will go back. With the ranges we're talking about, Russia cannot, close down the whole East Mediterranean. I suspect that when General Norkin, the Air Force commander, takes with him intel people and J5 or planning people and liaison people, they will transparently share the actual steps or flow of events and analyze in a professional way what happened. There are several issues to look at. One is better coordination, perhaps longer heads up times into deconfliction channels that we have. Second, perhaps better understanding of Israel where Russian crews are for no strikes, but I think this is already in place. Third would be the question of how Russia actually reins in the reckless activity of the Syrian air defense, which can also be a danger to civilian aircraft and airliners or air traffic. But the actual bottom line, and this is the place where the intel people come in, is that without appreciation of the underlying issue of Iran military buildup, this destabilizing Iranian activity and Israel's activity against it or response will probably be expected. Now, until now, Russia has been very, let's say, understanding or responsive or attentive to Israel's defense and protection concerns. We've seen it in the Golan Heights and in other places. So putting this incident in proportion still doesn't change the basic interest of all parties to go back to their, let's say, requested or desired end state. Russia wants to stabilize Syria. It understands Israel's defense prospects and concerns. It's not totally in line with Iran rushing in additional destabilizing factors or equipment. So I believe that with all regrets and so on, it will go back to strategic dialogue with Russia, between Israel and Russia, to some tough talks between Russia, Iran, and Syria, and then we'll need to see how it goes back to normalcy or to some routine.
Well, to ask the sort of future strategic question, I mean, we've discussed Iran's plans in Syria many times on this podcast, and I think we always seem to really come to the same conclusion, which is that Iran has decided that Syria is a vital strategic area for them to be operating. It gives them a win-win to shore up their very close ally, the Assad regime, but also to create a link with other forces that they support in Iraq and with Lebanon. And also third, and perhaps most interestingly for them, it allows them to move forces much closer to Israel and put Israel under pressure. And for all those reasons, it doesn't really seem like there's any move by Iran to step back from what is a very intensive military engagement in Syria. And you also have the leader of Hezbollah saying yesterday that Hezbollah is not leaving Syria, even though they may redeploy. So, I mean, how do you see this, changing into the future? I mean, Israel is still hitting these targets in Syria to stop Iran bringing in advanced weapons and those to Hezbollah, but essentially that could just carry on, for a very long time into the future. Do you see any big strategic change?
This indeed is a long game. It can't be judged or cut and assessed after a few moves or even a year. We're talking about pace, about how much or to what extent does Israel allow the Lebanese scenario to be reloaded. In effect, allowing Iran to build a launching pad or a launching base with air defense capability, with precision SSM, like surface-to-surface missiles, or other capacities, means that with time, a large deterrent is being built, and Israel's freedom of operation in the region will be decreasing. So Israel chose this time to learn something from its past and act early rather than late, and say, well, I will not let you establish those initial capabilities. From what we see until now, Iran is finding it very difficult and increasingly costly to flow its equipment forward. It started paying with its own blood and not only proxies. And its kinetic response towards Israel was pathetic until now. And that's not because of lack of motivation. So actually, when you judge it in the midterm, Israel successfully deprived Iran of the capability to build itself up uninterrupted in Syria. It's so far successfully deprived Iran of building an effective response to Israel in Syria and shooting back in a substantial way. And so, in this competition of wills, of motivations, of resources, actually Israel is fighting over a place where it enjoys great preponderance, dominance in intelligence, like the level of intelligence needed for such strikes cannot escape the eye. Israel knows where things are, even when they are secret. It carved itself a good strategic space for operation with good Russian understanding so far. And I want to believe, and I also suspect, that Russia's basic interests here, alongside don't hurt my troops, are unchanged. Russia doesn't want an active frontier of fighting between Iran and Israel in Syria. It's destabilizing its desired end state of a reinstated Syria with reconstruction, with revenue from the projects, from actually reaping the war dividends as the victor. So I wouldn't count the chickens yet. It's a long game. I think the Iranians have a lot to think about. It's becoming more and more expensive. Like last reports talk of over 130 Iranians dead in the last year's strikes. That's quite a lot. And so the old game of paying with others' blood, while Israel is fighting the proxies only and is reluctant to attack anything before it's being launched, well, that's over. We're now going upstream and trying to prevent things from getting worse and worse, and actually killing the locomotive when it's still a kettle, as the joke says.
Yeah. Fascinating. Thank you so much, Assaf. We've covered a lot of ground there and given us a lot to think about, but it's a really excellent assessment of what's going on. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.